The wind carried dust like dry whispers across the open prairie, bending the brittle grass toward the dying sun. A single horse stood tethered outside the weathered ranch house, ears flicking nervously at the sound of a distant wagon while groaning in protest. From the doorway, Clay Maddox watched with narrowed eyes as the wagon came into view, drawn by a pair of tired mules and driven by a man whose face he didn't recognize. But it wasn't the driver that made Clay's stomach knot. It was the girl in the back, her hands bound in front of her, hair tangled and matted like she'd been dragged halfway to hell. "Sir, please don't let them take me," she cried, voice raw with desperation, the words tearing through the heavy stillness of the land. Clay didn't move. Not yet. He just stood there, arms crossed over his broad chest, face unreadable under the brim of his sweat-stained hat. The driver spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust as he reined in the mules. "Got myself a runaway," the man drawled. "Figured I'd bring her back where she belongs." Clay's gaze shifted from the girl's terrified eyes to the man's smug grin, and something inside him twisted. But that wasn't where the story really began. No, this all started weeks earlier, long before the girl begged him to keep her safe, before the strangers with law on their side came pounding at his door. Back then, the summer heat had just begun to press down heavy on the land. Clay Maddox was a quiet man, a rancher who lived alone on the edge of Comanche territory, where the grass ran wild and the sky stretched forever. He'd fought his share of battles, some with bullets, some with silence, and came out of them with scars too deep to see. Folks in town called him stubborn, solitary, hard to know. But he wasn't cruel, just tired. Tired of burying too many good things. Friends, kin, and a wife he'd loved more than life itself. Most evenings he'd sit on the porch, a coffee cup in hand, staring at the horizon until the light bled out of the sky. He didn't ask much of the world anymore. Just enough rain for the cattle, enough quiet to keep the past from clawing its way back. That was the evening he first saw her. She'd appeared out of the haze like some half-starved ghost, stumbling along the dirt road that wound past his land. Her dress was torn, her bare feet cut and bleeding, and she carried herself like someone who'd been running far too long. Clay had watched her for a moment before setting down his cup and walking to meet her at the fence line. "You lost?" he asked, voice steady but not unkind. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, wide and glassy. She didn't speak at first, just shook her head weakly. "You hungry?" he tried again. This time she gave the faintest nod, and that was all it took. Clay swung the gate open and offered her his hand. She didn't take it, just followed him with the wary steps of a skittish colt. Inside, he gave her water first, then bread, then some leftover stew from the pot on the stove. She ate like someone who hadn't seen a meal in days, hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the spoon. He didn't ask her name that night, didn't press her with questions. He just let her eat, let her sit by the fire until her eyes fluttered shut from exhaustion. He'd laid a blanket over her shoulders and stepped outside to the porch, staring at the stars while questions gnawed at the back of his mind. The next morning, she was gone. Clay figured that was the end of it. A lost girl, maybe an orphan or a runaway, passing through on her way to someplace else. He told himself it wasn't his business. Folks carried their own burdens out here, and a wise man knew not to shoulder what wasn't his to bear. But he kept thinking about her, about the way her hands had shaken, the way her eyes darted like a trapped animal's. Something about her didn't sit right, and Clay Maddox had learned to trust his gut. A week later, the wagon rolled up his road with her in the back, bound and pleading. "Ran off from her master," the driver said. "Belongs to a man up near Abilene. Got a good bounty for bringing her back." Clay's jaw tightened. He'd heard talk in town about the man up near Abilene. Rich, cruel, the kind who treated people worse than cattle. But the law had a way of looking the other way when a man had money. The girl's eyes locked on Clay's, desperate, begging. "Sir, please." The smart thing would be to step aside. Let the man take her. Pretend none of this was his concern. Out here, a man could lose everything for choosing the wrong side of a fight that wasn't his. But Clay Maddox had never been much good at turning away from the truth, no matter how hard it bit. "Funny thing," Clay said slowly, voice even as the wind picked up. "I don't recall seeing your face in these parts before." The driver shifted uneasily, spitting again into the dirt. Don't reckon you'd have cause to. Maybe not. Clay's hand hovered near the butt of his Colt. But if you're planning to take someone off my land against her will, well, I'd say you got the wrong ranch. The man's grin faltered. The girl's breath hitched, hope flickering in her eyes. Clay knew this wasn't the end of it. Men like the one who claimed to own her didn't just let things go. There'd be trouble, one way or another. He could already feel it, heavy as storm clouds on the horizon. But standing there in the fading light, looking at that terrified girl, Clay made the choice that would change everything. The man on the wagon shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing as he studied Clay. You sure you want to stick your neck out for her? His tone carried that ugly mix of arrogance and warning. The kind of voice that came from someone who thought money and a gun on his hip gave him all the power he needed. Clay didn't flinch. She's not going anywhere today. The driver spat into the dirt, then let out a humorless chuckle. You're gonna regret this, rancher. Men like you always do. Clay's eyes stayed locked on him, one hand resting just close enough to his revolver to make the message clear. After a long moment, the man snapped the reins, muttered a curse under his breath, and turned the wagon around. The mules clattered down the dusty road, wheels groaning, until they disappeared beyond the rise. The girl hadn't moved. Her wrists were still bound, shoulders trembling as though she half expected Clay to change his mind. Slowly, he stepped forward and took out his pocket knife. Hold still, he said, voice quiet. A quick slice of the blade, and the rope fell away from her wrists. She rubbed the raw marks on her skin, not meeting his eyes. Why'd you do that? She asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Clay took a step back, slipping the knife into his pocket. Didn't seem right, letting a man treat you like property. She looked up then, eyes wet and shining with something he couldn't name. Thank you. He gave a single nod. Come inside. You need food, water, and you look like you could use some rest. That night, as the fire cracked in the hearth, she finally told him her name, Eliza. She spoke in halting words, every syllable heavy with exhaustion. Sold young to a landowner who worked her like a mule, whipped her when she faltered, kept her caged in his house like a prize. She'd run after his temper got worse, after she realized staying meant losing herself piece by piece. Clay listened in silence, jaw set tight. He'd seen cruelty before, too much of it in the war, and more still in the years that followed. Men with power rarely needed a reason to use it. He didn't ask for details, didn't press her for more than she was willing to share. When her voice broke and she couldn't go on, he just poured her another cup of water and let the silence stretch between them like a fragile thread. By morning, word had already begun to spread. When Clay rode into town for supplies, the stares followed him. Two men at the blacksmith's shop stopped talking as he passed, their eyes cutting toward him with suspicion. The general store clerk, a wiry man named Finch, leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. You took her in, didn't you? Clay's gaze stayed steady. Don't see how that's your concern. You don't know the kind of trouble you're courting, Finch said, glancing around to be sure no one was listening. That man she ran from, he's got friends. Friends with badges, if you catch my meaning. I catch it fine, Clay replied. He gathered his supplies, beans, flour, a box of ammunition, and left without another word. Back at the ranch, Eliza sat on the porch, a shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked up as he approached, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. But there was fear in her eyes, too, fear she couldn't quite hide. Clay saw it. He felt it, too, that sense of something gathering out there in the wide, empty land. Like the air before a storm, charged and waiting. That evening, as the sun burned down to embers on the horizon, Clay's neighbor rode up. Thomas Grant was a big man with a booming laugh, the kind who liked to settle disputes with his fists rather than words. But there was no laughter in him tonight. You're a damn fool, Clay, Thomas said, swinging off his horse. I heard about what happened. You can't just keep her. You know they'll come for her. Clay leaned against the porch railing, arms crossed. I'm not handing her back over. Thomas shook his head, spitting into the dirt. You think this is about right and wrong. It ain't. It's about power. That man owns half the county. If he wants her, He'll get her, one way or another. Maybe, Clay said, voice low. But it won't be with my help. Thomas studied him for a long moment, then cursed under his breath. You've always been too damn stubborn for your own good. When Thomas finally rode off, the night settled heavy around the ranch. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and coyotes yipped in the distance. Clay stood on the porch long after Eliza had gone inside, his hand brushing the worn grip of his revolver. He'd made his choice. Out on the horizon, far beyond the darkening prairie, a single campfire flickered in the distance, too far to be neighbors, too close to ignore. Clay's jaw tightened. Trouble wasn't coming. Trouble was already here. By dawn, the fire Clay had seen on the horizon was gone, but its memory stayed lodged in his gut like a splinter. He saddled his horse and rode the perimeter of his land, scanning the tree line, the dry creek beds, the far-off ridges where riders could watch unseen. The prairie looked the same as always, endless and empty, but Clay had lived too long out here to mistake quiet for safety. When he returned, Eliza was sitting by the fire pit, braiding a rope of wildflowers she'd gathered. She glanced up at him, her eyes carrying that tentative mix of gratitude and fear. They'll come, won't they? Clay removed his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and let out a slow breath. Yeah, they'll come. Before noon, riders appeared at the edge of the property, 3 men, dust rising behind their horses, rifles slung across their saddles. They didn't ride closer, just sat there watching like wolves waiting for the right moment to strike. One of them finally raised a hand in mock greeting before they turned and rode back toward town. They're testing you, Clay said quietly, more to himself than to Eliza. Seeing if you scare easy. That afternoon, Thomas Grant returned, his face grim. Clay, you got a bounty hunter in town askin about you. Says he's got legal papers to take the girl back. Papers don't make a thing right, Clay said. Thomas shifted uneasily in his saddle. Papers make it final, though. You stand in his way, you won't just have him to deal with. You'll have the sheriff, too. Clay glanced toward the house where Eliza was peeking through the curtains, her eyes wide. Le ching-kong. You'll get yourself killed, Thomas warned. And for what? Some girl you don't even know. Clay's eyes hardened. Because somebody's gotta tell men like that where the line is. By evening, Clay could feel the shift in the air. The prairie had fallen too quiet, no coyotes, no wind stirring the grass. As the last light bled out of the sky, hoofbeats sounded faint in the distance, steady and deliberate. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, clutching the shawl tighter around her shoulders. They're coming. Clay nodded, checking the revolver at his hip. Stay inside. Whatever happens, you don't open that door. The hoofbeats grew louder, joined by the metallic rattle of spurs and the creak of saddle leather. A group of riders emerged from the darkness, their faces shadowed beneath the brims of their hats. At the front rode a tall man with a long black coat, rifle resting across his saddle. Evenin', Maddox, the man called. His voice was smooth, too polite, like a snake just before it struck. Name's Luther Kane. Got papers here say you're harboring stolen property. She's not property, Clay said, stepping down from the porch to meet him halfway. Kane smiled faintly, as if amused by Clay's defiance. Law says otherwise. You hand her over now, we ride out peaceful. You make this hard? Well, let's just say hard don't end well for folks in your position. Clay stared at him for a long moment, the night air thick between them. She's not leaving with you. Kane's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. You sure about that? Clay's hand hovered near his gun. Dead sure. Kane let out a slow sigh, then gestured to the men behind him. They dismounted one by one, spreading out like a pack of coyotes circling their prey. Inside the house, Eliza pressed herself against the window, tears streaming silently down her face. She had seen this play out too many times before. Men with power, men who took what they wanted, and no one strong enough to stop them. But tonight felt different. Clay Maddox stood in their way, not with grand speeches or reckless bravado, but with a quiet, immovable resolve that seemed to unsettle the men circling him. Last chance, Maddox, Kane said, voice hardening. Clay didn't move. You had your chance the moment you stepped on my land. The night seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't yet come. Kane's hand twitched toward his rifle. Clay's fingers brushed the worn grip of his revolver. The standoff had begun. The silence between them stretched until it felt like the whole prairie had gone still, every creature holding its breath. Clay's fingers rested lightly on the grip of his Colt, but he didn't draw. Kane's eyes narrowed, reading him, weighing the cost of forcing the matter. Then, in a voice just loud enough to carry, Clay said, "You got 3 seconds to ride out of here. After that, you're trespassers. And I don't treat trespassers kindly." Kane didn't flinch. "You're just one man, Maddox. You think you can take all of us?" Clay didn't answer. He didn't have to. The stillness in his eyes, the way he stood with his boots planted firm in the dirt, said everything. Kane's smile faltered. Men like him were used to fear, used to people breaking at the first sign of trouble. But Clay Maddox wasn't breaking. Not tonight. "Mount up," Kane ordered finally, voice sharp. "We're not done here." The riders hesitated, casting glances at one another. One of them muttered, "He ain't bluffing." Another spat into the dirt and swung back into his saddle. Kane lingered a moment longer, fixing Clay with a look that promised this wasn't over. Then he, too, mounted and turned his horse toward town. Clay didn't lower his hand until their silhouettes disappeared into the dark. When he stepped back onto the porch, Eliza was waiting. Her face was pale, eyes wide, hands trembling as she clutched the shawl around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "They'll come back." Clay met her gaze evenly. "I know." "Why?" Her voice cracked. "You don't even know me." He leaned against the porch post, the weight of years heavy in his stance. "I've seen men like Kane my whole life. Men who think they can own people. Men who take because no one stops them. Somebody's gotta tell them no." Her lips trembled, as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally, she stepped closer, her hands twisting together nervously. "They won't. Content truncated due to size limit. Use line ranges to read in chunks.